Hello YouTube and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host Luke Whitaker and this is the show where we talk about all things Japanese politics in English. And this week I'm asking the question, is it too late for Shigeru Ishiba as the Japanese Prime Minister? Is his time up? Does he need to go? And it's pretty dramatic that we're even asking this question. A relatively short time ago, things seemed relatively rosy for Ishiba. I mean, he'd had a difficult start. He was in charge of a minority government, and he'd had a bad election in 2024. But things were looking relatively good. You know, he had his big sit-down, finally, with Trump, had a meeting with him. That went over fairly well. He got the nice PR photo. He was, had the meeting with China ahead to look forward to. He looked to be making progress in getting his budget through. He was having relatively successful talks with other parties, albeit having to make concessions to get there, but nonetheless, it seemed like he was able to pass legislation. And now there's being calls for him to step down and talk of scandal and high disapproval ratings. How has this happened in such a short space of time? Where did it all go wrong? Well, it's all because of this gift scandal. And just to recap that briefly, basically the LDP has had scandals in the past with the slush fund scandal. Ishiba was brought in sort of partly as a response to that. He was seen as a little bit of an outsider, not tied so much to the slush fund scandal. But now it's come out that he gave gifts in terms of gift vouchers to 15 first-year lawmakers. Ostensibly, the gift was like a token present, so they could go buy suits because they're first-year lawmakers. It's like a symbolic gift thing. However, that's gone down very poorly, and at first there were accusations that this might have fallen foul of Japanese law. There's very strict controls on the giving out of gifts by public officials, but Ishiba's denied this. He says it doesn't fall foul of the law and that he used his own funds to give out the gifts. And he strongly denies the fact that the allegation that he may have broken the law. But nonetheless, it appears to look quite bad for him, and it certainly rates as a scandal and has made the rounds on the news and is creating all sorts of difficulty for him. Which, as I said before, giving out a gift, I think it's something like $600 to $700 amount. Doesn't seem like a particularly bad thing in terms of the grand scale of scandals, but I think perhaps it plays into this perception of the LDP and this focus now that the past scandals have been exposed on whether this is a pattern of behaviour. It sort of maybe conforms what people were fearful of thinking about them if you're an LDP supporter, or what you already thought of them if you were an opponent, if you had a low opinion of the LDP, if you weren't a voter of the LDP. And it sort of adds to that negative impression people had of them. So asking the question, is this severe enough that he might actually have to go on the back of this, having only been in the job for a relatively short amount of time? Well, to argue against the idea that he needs to go, you could say one factor is that Ishiba appears to be digging his heels in. I've already said he denied that he's broken the law, and he appears to be resisting calls on him. He already had opponents within the LDP and obviously the opposition who would like to see one of them as in place as Prime Minister, but he's putting up a fight and he's pointing out that it's something that other Prime Ministers have done in the past. It's a relatively small amount of money, and this is a customary thing of new Prime Ministers giving out like token amount gifts, and it's never been a problem before, and why is it suddenly a problem now if it's not against the law? And though it does appear to be widely perceived as a negative thing for him to have done, he is questioning why it's suddenly being raised now, why it's suddenly seen as such a big problem, and why there's such an amount of attention on this when it as I say, it's been this. He would claim this is relatively routine and it's just a small gift. Again, as I've said, it's a relatively small amount of money that he's given out. Also adds into the impression that maybe it's not it's still a scandal, of course, but it's not the biggest scandal in the world. Another reason to resist for Ishiba is that he has been elected to Prime Minister on his fifth time running to be the leader of the LDP, and he said at the time that this was his final attempt to run to be the head of the LDP and Prime Minister. Is there any way back for him? This has been something he's wanted his entire life. He's ran numerous times for it. As I say, he had this perception as an outsider when the Abe faction was so dominant. Would things ever really align for him to become Prime Minister again if he went now? If he just gives up, he's effectively had this job for a matter of months, something he's been aiming for his whole life, and then he'd be leaving it all behind with a very unlikely route of return. And he's previously said that this was his final attempt running. So he'd be in a position where he's lost effectively his life goal after only a few months if he doesn't put up a fight. And so that puts all that more reason on him to sort of dig in and for him to be highly motivated to resist this scandal and to keep going at all costs. Also, you could mention the fact that he's 68. Now, that's not really old in the grand scale of things. I mean, if you look at Trump and Biden, for example, who ran in their 70s, and of course, Trump got defeated in an election and then regained the head of his status as the Republican nominee 4 years later, and then was elected. So he found a way out at a more advanced age than that, of course. So it's not really that old, but it does sort of lend to the idea that maybe he hasn't got as much time to make a political comeback. And also, if you look at, for example, a prominent recent example of someone who was prime minister and then had to step down and then come back was Shinzo Abe. I believe in 2007 he had a difficult election, I believe, and he also may have had some health issues that contributed to him stepping down. So to use that as a recent example, in 2007, Abe was only 52 when he stepped down the first time, and although he did make a comeback, he was at the time around 16 years younger than Shigeru Ishiba has now, so he had that much more time to remain within the party as a prominent figure and sort of wait for his moment to come back. And ultimately, he was successful and went on to become a very long-running leader of Japan, to say the least. But Ishiba perhaps doesn't have that luxury, and again, he's publicly did say that this would be his last attempt running. So it gives Ishiba, as I say, that much more incentive to hang on, given that he's wanted this as his goal his entire political career. Is he really going to give it up so easily? Another factor is you have to think about is one of the key methods they might get rid of him if there was a no confidence motion. Now, on the face of it, a no confidence motion seems very possible given the LDP is a minority party. So all that would have to happen is that all the opposition parties would have to bandy together. But would the opposition parties actually want a no confidence vote in Ishiba? Now, on the surface, this seems like a great opportunity for them. They've got the leader. He's got through a difficult election. He's embroiled in a scandal now, and they could just simply pass a no confidence motion, and it would seem like a response to this scandal, as I see it, like an opportune moment, rather than if they'd done it straight after the election, when it might seem like they were just taking advantage of the sort of the political calculus. But they would be seen, if they did it now, as maybe responding to this scandal, and it would make the story about him being no confidence voted all about the scandal. But the reason they might not want that is that Ishiba is very diminished by the scandal. It's hurt his approval ratings, and it makes him that much weaker. And there's a July election coming up just months away for the upper house. The LDP already might be struggling to hold on to seats. They were maybe facing the prospect of losing seats again like they did in 2024 in the upper house in this election. But now, if they keep Ishiba in, he's tainted by the scandals. He's got low approval rating, and it makes the story about him and his disapproval. Going into the July elections, it makes the story all about him. So they're sort of taking a risk if they get rid of him. And there's the danger that if the LDP put in a new leader, it gives them a chance to rebrand, few months, run on a new leader. If they were to be able to find someone who was maybe seemed more popular than Ishiba, and given the short space of time, it's always very fraught mid-cycle between elections putting in a new leader. Has been seen many times. But if you find someone popular, they make a good initial impression on the electorate, and suddenly you go into that July election, it completely changes potentially the calculus from being about Ishiba and this scandal and him being unpopular and the record of the LDP to being about, we've got this new leader, they're changing things, it's a sort of a vote of confidence in men, rather than being about the scandal and Ishiba being diminished. So it's difficult to pull off, but it is taking a risk if they get rid of Ishiba. Another factor is that if the other parties step back and say, we're not going to no confidence vote, we're simply going to let this play out, the LDP might oust Ishiba themselves, which means that the hands are completely clean in terms of the opposition parties. They've had nothing to do with getting rid of a leader, and it would just make the LDP look all that more divided, like an infighting party obsessed with scandal, and it would maybe take a little bit longer for them to get that through. Would it happen before the July election? If it happened just before, even better. There's no chance for that sort of new leader to get off the ground smoothly and have like a honeymoon period. It might even be happening as they're going into the election that they're maybe contesting this, if the LDP were to time that poorly. And so in many ways you could maybe make the argument, like the famous saying, Napoleon, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. If the LDP are exposing scandals about Ishiba and they're infighting, just let them go to it and let them, fight amongst themselves. So it might arguably be the smartest thing for the opposition to just do nothing and let Ishiba survive just that little bit longer, and then maybe wait till after the July election to force a no confidence when the LDP is even more diminished from potentially having lost seats in that July election. Now, in terms of what the opposition leaders have actually said about this, the DPFP leader has said he's considering it among other measures. So nice and neutral, leaves his options open. The CDP leader, I believe, has said he doesn't want to let them off that easy, and that he wants a thorough examination. And so this leads into exactly what I was saying, that if they were to drag this out and really put Ishiba on the stand and keep questioning him about this scandal, it just makes the story run that much longer into the July election and makes it that much worse for the LDP. Whereas if you were to just call a no confidence vote, it maybe lets him off the hook, and then they maybe get a potentially more popular leader in. So he seems the CDP, who have the second biggest block of votes after the LDP, are taking the stance of we'll let him stay in, and we'll just keep, turning the screws and examining the scandal and making things worse for the LDP rather than getting rid of Ishiba when he's unpopular. And as I say, they don't appear willing to, risk things by changing course and getting in a new leader, which could potentially help the LDP. And likely the opposition, as I say, prefer the LDP to look divided, diminished going into this election, rather than giving them a chance to, refresh and get their act together under a new leader. There's also the factor that the budget is going through considerations right now, as well as obviously the July elections being a few months away, they have to think about getting the budget through. So perhaps they might also want that to be behind them and to have that pass through the House before they think about a no confidence motion. There's a chance that maybe they look like they're playing too much with politics if they were to effectively bring Ishiba down right when they're talking about a budget, and to effectively delay that for months. It might look too much like inside baseball from the opposition. They might look a bit more mature in the eyes of the electorate if they were to sensibly pass the budget and then look to whether they should get no confidence Ishiba. Now, another argument, of course, to suggest that Ishiba shouldn't go, that he should stay, is that aside from Ishiba, as I say, digging in and being very motivated, it appears to stay for obvious reasons that you can imagine. He's also had some defenders. For example, the Justice Minister, Suzuki Keizuke, has come out and defended Ishiba and effectively said that this shouldn't be a resigning matter, and he's defended him and said that this has been sort of standard practice, and also it's not just a problem with past prime ministers of Japan or with the LDP, and it's a diet-wide problem. And so if effectively saying this is something that every party has done, and it's a diet-wide custom to sort of give out gifts like this. So if the public don't like that custom and they don't like the look of it, I suppose you could infer from that it's fine, but I guess he's saying it's unfair to narrow this criticism just on the PM when it's a diet-wide thing. He has had some support in that respect from his party. And also you could maybe make the argument that if Ishiba goes, you are effectively giving the last word that this is a disastrous thing and it's beyond the pale, and that's all that people will remember. Perhaps in years from now, a few years from now when they have the next election, although it may not go that far, that all the electorate will remember was that there was a gift scandal and it must have been very bad because Ishiba resigned. Whereas if he stays, he has the chance to sort of defend himself and maybe the scandal fades in time. Whereas if he just says, okay, it's a resigning matter, I'm going, that's sort of it. You can't diminish it or refute it because the Prime Minister himself felt it was so bad he had to resign over it. So it sort of gives the last word on it in that sense. Now, in terms of arguments saying that yes, Ishiba should go, the big one is the polls, which in some respects look quite hard to come back from. They're quite negative numbers. His disapproval is up. According to one poll, it's minus 64%, which is quite severe. So minus 64% disapproval according to one, which is very bad for a Prime Minister. However, a separate poll did show majority disapproval, I think around 60%. Did show majority's disapproval of this. However, in a sort of a follow-up question of how much do people care, apparently 60% didn't think it was a resigning matter. So yes, they disapprove, they don't like the scandal, but they don't think it's quite a resigning matter. It's not that big a scandal, which I suppose is encouraging, as bad as the polls are. Another argument in terms of Ishiba going is that maybe he's not on that strong foundations because he wasn't the most popular leader to begin with. Like, as I say, historically, the Abe faction in recent years has been the most popular faction within the LDP. They were diminished, and that's what sort of led Ishiba to coming in through the middle. But it required a runoff. Like in the initial election, it was Sanae who was the most popular, and it was only because the third place candidate dropped out and sort of he moved his votes towards Ishiba that he won in the end. He wasn't like initially the most popular candidate within the LDP. So you could maybe say that although he, of course, won it, perhaps he didn't initially start out in the most popular position. He sort of came in through the middle, and he won because of the particular circumstances of the time, i.e. the LDP felt they needed a change, they needed someone outside the Abe faction, they needed a fresh start. But perhaps he maybe wasn't the most popular figure within the LDP party, which diminishes his position to begin with. And of course, he has already had one bad election result. So do you want to go into a July election with someone who's already been defeated once before? As a LDP House of Council member said the other week, do you want to really go to another election with someone who's already badly lost an election? And also, is there really a long term with Ishiba? As I say, he's lost one general election. Are the signs there that he could turn it around? And regardless of what happens in July, could he win the next general election? That's really the question the LDP have to ask themselves. Likely, his ultimate fate depends on how unified the opposition are, both within the LDP and outside. As I say, if all the opposition banded together, they could no confidence vote him. But it's relies on them to coordinate that. We've already seen differing stances on the DPFP, who are a bit more neutral, and the CDP, who are sort of inclined not to immediately have a vote. They're sort of are in favour of dragging this out a little bit more and sort of putting the pressure on Ishiba, which makes me think that a confidence vote isn't that likely immediately. So it depends whether the LDP, how unified they are to force him out and how motivated they are. Of course, there were some who weren't that happy with him being elected to begin with. There's some who've come out recently to criticise him before this scandal, but can they get their act together? How unified are they? And can they unite behind a clear opposition candidate? And how much do they really want this? Are they really willing to exit their prime minister in the middle of this scandal right before a July election? How badly do they want this, really? I think that's what really it comes down to, and whether they can organise and unite in time. There's also the possibility that if this move doesn't come from the LDP, it comes from the opposition and they no confidence vote him, that Ishiba could simply shrug his shoulders and say, okay, well, I'm calling another election. That would be quite dramatic. I believe it would be only the third time in Japanese history that there's been a double election like that, where there's been a general election, then a short time after there's been yet another one. But that is a card that Ishiba could play. He could just simply say, I'm going to call an election, and then he could sort of try and change the national conversation and say, you weren't happy with us last time, but here's my vision for Japan, etc. And it might be more of a general conversation rather than about this scandal, as politics in Japan seems to be right now. If he were to have the time of a general election, perhaps he could of course, change his fortunes and try and win a fresh mandate. That's very challenging, but it could be the tact he'd take, as I say, if he's really determined to stay in the job. That's certainly a possibility that he could try and call a general election rather than just accepting being ousted by the opposition. And so there's also the question of, are the opposition ready? Are they really up for an election right now? Is that what they really want? So they have to be prepared when thinking about a no confidence vote for, is Ishiba going to call our bluff, and are we ready for that? It's something they have to consider also. I thought it'd be interesting to have like a very quick look at some of the potential successors of Ishiba if this were to happen now, or perhaps after July, or any time in the future in the next parliament. This is by no means an exhaustive list of everyone that could replace him, but I'm just looking at a few prominent names. Now, the obvious one you have to start with is Sanae Takaichi. She was the initial frontrunner in the previous election. In the end, as I say, Ishiba came through the middle and took votes from the third place candidate, and she ended up finishing second. She is more that natural right-wing, more conservative part of the LDP. She's sort of the Abe faction. The problem she faces, of course, is although she's going to be the prominent person that everyone's thinking of right now in terms of a potential successor, that's very natural given she finished second. And it would be quite a moment. It would be Japan's first female prime minister, of course. She does have problems. The reason why she didn't beat Ishiba initially was that she's associated with that Abe faction, which is tied up with scandals like the Unification Church, the slush fund. Those problems haven't gone away. And although Ishiba looks very bad right now with this gift scandal, it sort of does hark the mind back, I think for some people back to the slush fund scandal. It's a scandal relating to money and the LDP. So the slush fund, the gift scandal could force Ishiba out, but does that necessarily help Sanae if she is motivated to replace Ishiba, if that's what she wants, and if she's going to go for it, she perhaps would prefer him to go out in different circumstances, a scandal that wasn't related to money, and she still has that initial problem being from the with her and many of her supporters, as I say, being from the Abe faction, being tainted with that. But Ishiba's had his chance. He got tried as the alternative candidate, and if he goes and resigns in a scandal, he would be said to have failed, and so she will have a natural claim of, well, I was the initial front runner, you thought you could go a different way, it hasn't worked out, is it not natural to return to me, and give the Abe faction, which in recent memory, although it has been tainted by these scandals, was a successful electoral force that people backed time and time again. I'm more of a natural conservative, maybe I can appeal more to our base, get them motivated, get them back voting for the LDP, cut off the risk of votes going towards parties like the Conservative Party of Japan and Sanzito. Maybe I can re-energize our base and get them back on board, and it presents a different election. And of course, she, as I said, first female prime minister, not to trivialize that, but it sort of changes the conversation towards that, and sort of going back to the Abe faction rather than scandal. It gives sort of pundits and voters something to think about other than just ongoing scandal in the LDP. It's something new, it's a different change, it's a change of tack. It also presents an interesting dynamic if she were to become prime minister, given the Korean situation, where one of the potential successors to President Yoon has said things as sort of maybe more critical of Japan in the past, whereas Sanae has also been sort of not been afraid of provoking controversy when it comes to Korea. So to have those two having to lead respectively South Korea and Japan and have a diplomatic relationship would be interesting to say the least, potentially very fraught. But yeah, that would be a dynamic to think about, but that's getting ahead of ourselves, as she's just, as I say, the obvious potential candidate to replace Ishiba at the time of being. Another candidate you'd have to consider is Shinjirō Koizumi. Now, he is the candidate who came third in the previous 2024 leadership election, and it was his sort of more moderate votes going towards Ishiba that allowed him to succeed in the end. Now, he's relatively a younger man. He's only 43 years old. He sort of left his, calling card, sort of marked his position as a potential future leader of the LDP by finishing third and getting a good result. Of course, he didn't win, but sort of got a good number of votes, pivotal enough for that to, in the end, when he went out, for those votes to swing the election by going to Ishiba. If you look at it that way, so he's someone you have to think about as a potential candidate if maybe they don't want to go so much in the Abe direction, but they want renewed, fresh leadership. He could certainly be a prominent name who they might consider. In terms of his background, as many politicians are, he's the son of a former prominent politician. He's the son of a former Prime Minister of Japan, and also he's served as the Minister of the Environment from 2019 to 2021. That's his. He's not currently serving as a minister, I believe, but that's his sort of experience there. So he's a prominent name, as I say, finishing third along with behind Sanae. You have to think about him as a potential candidate in any leadership race. As if I say they want to go with sort of a younger, new approach, a sort of a fresh-faced candidate who's not so much tied with the Abe and the slush fund scandal. He's very much a name you could consider. Another person you could have to mention, of course, is the previous Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida. Now, he's 67 years old, so he's a year younger than Ishiba. And now, of course, he had to resign previously. He did serve as leader of Japan before Ishiba, but had to resign, I believe, partially because of these slush fund scandals. So he's sort of not a fresh approach in that respect. But you have to mention him because he's had a very prominent career. It's not unheard of for a Prime Minister of Japan to leave, resign, and then come back again. And he's served all sorts of posts, defence, foreign affairs, for example. And, as I say, he's a former Prime Minister. So you have to put his name in there. And you might sort of say, if Ishiba were to go, I know, although perhaps he doesn't represent a fresh start, he's a sort of a very senior figure within the LDP. He's been there and done it before. He's got the experience as a Prime Minister of Japan, and so you could maybe see him as a safe pair of hands, someone who's been there before to take over. Although, as I say, he wouldn't represent a fresh start, but he's perhaps got the experience. So he might be, if he wants to put his name back there and you have to mention him as a potential contender. Another name I should mention that I've seen out there named as a potential successor is Takayuki Kobayashi. He's the former economic security minister, and he's also a prominent figure within the LDP, whose name I've seen mentioned, so you have to consider him as a potential successor also. As I say, not an exhaustive list, just some of the names I've seen in the mix. But yeah, that really rounds out the show this week, guys. That's all the news I've got. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whittaker. Thank you so much for listening. Sayonara, goodbye.